There aren't a lot of ethnic Jews like me that belong to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Other members usually find it interesting that I am one, and I know there are some others because every once in a while I meet one. Since Latter-day Saints care a great deal about the ancient covenants of Israel and the prophecies of the gathering, holidays like Hanukkah are a special time for me to share my Jewish heritage with my children. My mother was born Jewish and raised in a Reformed Jewish household. She attended synagogue sometimes and grew up with Jewish cousins, aunts, and uncles. Her ancestors came to America to seek a better life during the days of violent pogroms in Central and Eastern Europe and political upheavals in the Middle East. My father was not Jewish, but by the time I was born, my parents had resolved their religious differences, and both had become committed members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. My father always found my mother's Hebrew heritage fascinating, so they tried to keep it alive in our home. I knew from a young age that the thing my mother cherished most about the restored gospel was the temple. To her, the temple stood as a symbol of her fondest hopes, of family bonds that would one day outlast death, the connection point to a heaven of eternal togetherness and belonging. But even though I knew she loved the temple, I did not pick up on the fact that the small Hanukkah celebration we held every year before Christmas was, in fact, all about the temple. Hanukkah was originally called the Feast of Dedication, referring to the dedication of the temple at Jerusalem. As I became a parent with young children with myself, I wanted to tell the Hanukkah story in a way that puts the significance of this temple in perspective. So I start my Hanukkah story much earlier and end it much later than many Jews. I start with Abraham. 10 generations after the prophet Noah, who started the world over after it was destroyed by flood, most of Noah's descendants had become very wicked. To justify violent and corrupt practices, they made up false gods, selfish and merciless. As a child, Abraham was saved by an angel of God from being sacrificed to idols in a horrible act of cult abuse. Abraham left everything he knew to build an independent life of faithfulness and goodness with his family. God said of Abraham, "All the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him, for I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment." His legacy was passed on to his son Isaac and then to his grandson Jacob, renamed Israel, to whom God promised, "And thy seed shall be as the dust of the earth, and in thee and in thy seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed." God chose Israel and his family to be an example to the world and to bless the world and promised them a land to do it from. But life is messy, and the members of that family made many messy decisions. They were driven by famine into Egypt, where after several generations they were enslaved. And the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor, and they made their lives bitter with hard bondage in mortar and in brick and in all manner of service in the field. They languished in slavery for generations, but God did not forget his promises. He called Moses to deliver the people from Egypt by a strong hand. They walked through the Red Sea dry-shod and wandered in the wilderness for 40 years until they were ready to enter the promised land. Moses had them build a tabernacle, a makeshift temple, until they could build a permanent one, an oasis of purity in the middle of that dusty desert, a sanctuary from the world, the symbol of their most sacred covenants and blessings, a place where God was both welcome and expected. Moses taught, "If you will obey my voice indeed and keep my covenant, then ye shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people, and ye shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and an holy nation." But the purpose of choosing them to be God's peculiar people was not to inflate their heads or make them think they were better than others. He chose them for the same reason he chose their ancestors, to bless all the families of the earth, to be a living example of light and truth. But people are messy, and they do not always live up to their potential. Moses warned them, "When ye shall have remained long in the land, and shall corrupt yourselves, and make you a graven image, and shall do evil in the sight of the Lord your God, I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day, that ye shall soon utterly perish from off the land. And the Lord shall scatter you among the nations, and ye shall be left few in number among the heathen. And there ye shall serve gods, the work of men's hands, wood and stone, which neither see, nor hear, nor eat, nor smell. But this terrible prophecy of the scattering came with a great promise, that it would not last forever. When thou art in tribulation, and all these things are come upon thee, even in the latter days, if thou turn to the Lord thy God, and shalt be obedient unto his voice, he will not forsake thee, neither destroy thee, nor forget the covenant of thy fathers, which he sware unto them. The permanent temple was built in the days of King Solomon the Wise. The people enjoyed peace and prosperity, but it did not last. Over the next few hundred years, the people of Israel, instead of blessing the world, became increasingly influenced by the world. Idolatry, human sacrifice, and other evil heathen practices grew. They mocked the messengers of God and despised his words and misused his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord arose against his people, till there was no remedy. The warnings of Moses began to come true. The northern 10 tribes of Israel were destroyed and their people scattered by the king of Assyria. And a century or so later, the Babylonian Empire did the same thing to the southern tribes, called the Jews. And they burnt the house of God and brake down the wall of Jerusalem. And them that had escaped from the sword carried he away to Babylon, where they were servants to him and his sons, him meaning King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. People often do not realize what they have until it's gone. By the rivers of Babylon there we sat down, yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof. For there they that carried us captive required of us a song. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? After the chaos of these times, the northern tribes of Israel mostly lost their cohesive identity as Israelites, blending more and more into other nations, and we now call them the lost 10 tribes. But as for the southern tribes of Israel, the Jews, about 50 years after the destruction of Jerusalem, they were allowed to return to their homeland and rebuild Jerusalem, the walls and the temple, with permission of the Persian kings who had come to rule the Babylonian Empire. When the foundation was laid to rebuild the house of the Lord, many of the priests and Levites, ancient men that had seen the first house, wept with a loud voice, so that the people could not discern this noise of the shout of joy from the noise of weeping of the people. For the people shouted with a loud shout, and the noise was heard afar off. The Hanukkah story, as most Jews tell it, starts a few hundred years later. The Jews, ever since Babylon, clung to their separate national and religious identity, even as their territory was conquered by Alexander the Great and ruled by Greek-speaking overlords. Some of these foreign rulers were tolerant of the Jews' ways, but not Antiochus of Syria. About a century and a half before Christ, Antiochus began to outlaw the Jews' most basic religious practices, in one of those horrible efforts we see throughout history, and even today, to stamp out the voices of those who dare to believe differently. Antiochus would not even let them pray. They would hide, sometimes even in caves, to pray, and bring out their dreidels when the soldiers would come by, so they could pretend they were kneeling to gamble instead of praying, so the soldiers would leave them alone. Antiochus ultimately sent his armies to ransack and defile the temple, filling it with idols, unclean animals, and heathen practices that were repugnant to everything the Jews stood for. The brave priest Mattathias fled to the hills and gathered together a resistance, and his son Judah the Maccabee, which means the hammer, led a revolt for 4 long years, until they finally forced out their oppressive rulers and won independence for their nation. The Feast of Dedication, or Hanukkah, commemorates the rededication of the temple, where the Jews purified the filth and disorder and restored it to purity to bring it back into compliance with the law of Moses. Moses had taught that the golden candle on the altar of incense was to burn perpetually as a symbol of the people's constant connection to God. And thou shalt command the children of Israel that they bring thee pure oil olive, beaten for the light, to cause the lamp to burn always. Aaron and his sons shall order it from evening to morning before the Lord. They lit the lamp as soon as possible, but discovered there was not enough of the oil to burn until the 8-day journey could be taken to get more. But the golden candle stayed miraculously lit. The people saw this as a sign that God had accepted their labors and offering and approved the rededication of his house. For many Jews, the Hanukkah story ends here, but not for me. The independence won by the Maccabees lasted about 100 years until the Roman Empire took the land, and the temple at Jerusalem was still in operation even 60 years later when Jesus Christ was born. It was in this temple that Jesus was blessed as a baby at the hands of Simeon. It was in this temple that Jesus at age 12 was found sitting in the midst of the doctors, and they were hearing him and asking him questions. It was from this temple that Jesus drove out the money changers, because his Father's house was to be a house of prayer, not a den of thieves. We have one record in the New Testament of Jesus attending Hanukkah, or the Feast of Dedication, in this temple. And it was at Jerusalem the Feast of Dedication, and it was winter. And Jesus walked in the temple on Solomon's porch. It was on Hanukkah that many Jews asked him to declare openly whether he was the Christ, not because they wanted to know, but because they were ready to punish him for saying it. It was on that Hanukkah that he taught, "My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me." It was on that Hanukkah that he proclaimed, "I and my Father are one," and some tried to take him and stone him to death for saying it, although he escaped. It is a sad irony of human nature that it is hard for people to see when they have become the oppressors. Those who sought to end Jesus that day may have seen themselves as defending the temple like the Maccabees, when in fact they had become like Antiochus, actively trying to snuff out the light and life of the world, a light that is endless, that can never be darkened. And it is even more devastating to contemplate how groups and nations of supposed Christians over the centuries since then have engaged in violence and oppression toward Jews on a scale beyond horror, pretending to defend Christ by punishing the innocent in the most unchristlike ways imaginable. There is no such thing as being so right that it gives license to do wrong. I give thanks that I live in a day when the heavens are open, living prophets speak in the name of the living God, and temples are again being built on earth. Since Hanukkah is a temple holiday, I celebrate what those buildings mean to me personally, how they have been for me an oasis of clarity and stability in a world full of uncertainty and decay, a place of learning, insight, and connection with the infinite. On Hanukkah, I sing the latter-day hymns about the temple, like "We Love Thy House, O God," or "The Spirit of God like a fire is burning," or the primary song, "I Love to See the Temple," right alongside traditional Jewish songs like Hava Nagila, which means "Let us rejoice." Many members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints do not realize they have celebrated Hanukkahs, because Hanukkah is the Hebrew word for a temple dedication. Hanukkah is also the word for when we dedicate our homes, or when we dedicate ourselves as temples to the Most High, or consecrate our heart, might, mind, and strength to the Lord, who has always committed his heart, might, mind, and strength to us. I honor my Jewish ancestors who would light the menorah to remember the light that did not die, who ate oily foods like latkes and donuts to remember the oil that did not fail, who played with dreidels to remember those who had to hide so they could pray, to remind us that our privilege to worship God is precious and fragile and worth fighting for. I sing with them Baruch atah Adonai to the Lord, Asher kireshanu b'mitzvotav, showing us a more excellent way with his commandments. And as we light the ner shel Chanukah, or the lights of dedication, I try to remember the purpose of God's covenant with Israel in the first place, not just to be a peculiar people, but to bless the families of the earth, all of them. The latter-day temples stand as an invitation to all, Jew and Gentile, black and white, bond and free, male and female, echoing the words of Isaiah through the halls of time. Come ye, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways. It is with those thoughts that I say Hanukkah Sameach, or in English, Happy Hanukkah.